If you have your Bibles this morning, and I hope that you do, turn to Ecclesiastes chapter 8. Ecclesiastes chapter 8. You know, there is a fascination within the human psyche about pushing past limits. This is why we drive 78 in a 75, because that 75 is just too restrictive. We watch every 4 years as these athletes try to break what seemed like an unbreakable record 4 years ago in the Olympics. It shows up in pop culture as well. Maybe you read a book or saw the movie Limitless, in which there was this idea that you could take this drug and it would enable you to access all parts of your brain to push back the limits of your biology. We're fascinated by this idea. Yet in our passage this morning, Solomon, in his wisdom, is going to tell us something that's drastically different. This chapter begins with an acknowledgement of the value of wisdom, and that the wise set themselves apart. They uniquely understand the circumstances and the patterns of this world. And he asks, who is like the wise? For there is truly immense benefit and blessing to living the wise life. That's why we spend so much time studying a book about wisdom. Yet in regular Solomon fashion, he doesn't want us to think we have too much of a good thing. So he splashes some cold water on us this morning and reminds us that even wisdom will only get you so far. You have limits. And wisdom is not about breaking past those limits, but it is about living well within them. So look with me, if you will, at Ecclesiastes chapter 8. Solomon writes, "Who is like the wise, and who knows the interpretation of a thing? A man's wisdom makes his face shine, and the hardness of his face is changed. I say, keep the king's command because of your oath to God. Be not hasty to go from his presence. Do not take your stand in an evil cause, for he does whatever he pleases. For the word of the king is supreme, and who may say to him, what are you doing? Whoever keeps a command will know no evil thing, and the wise heart will know the proper time and the just way. For there is a time and a way for everything, although man's trouble lies heavy on him. For he does not know what is to be, for who can tell him how it will be? No man has power to retain the spirit or power over the day of death. There is no discharge from war, nor will wickedness deliver those who are given to it. All this I observed while applying my heart to know all that is done under the sun, when man had power over man to his hurt. Then I saw the wicked buried. They used to go in and out of the holy place and were praised in the city where they had done such things. This also is vanity. Because the sentence against an evil deed is not executed speedily, the heart of the children of man is fully set to do evil. Though a sinner does evil 100 times and prolongs his life, yet I know that it will be well for those who fear God, because they fear before him. But it will not be well with the wicked, neither will he prolong his days like a shadow, because he does not fear before God. There is a vanity that takes place on earth, that there are righteous people to whom it happens according to the deeds of the wicked, and there are wicked people to whom it happens according to the deeds of the righteous. I said that this also is vanity. And I commend joy. For man has nothing better under the sun but to eat and drink and be joyful, for this will go with him in his toil through the days of his life that God has given him under the sun. When I applied my heart to know wisdom and to see the business that is done on earth, how neither day nor night do one's eyes see sleep, then I saw all the work of God, that man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun. However much man may toil in seeking, he will not find it out. Even though a wise man claims to know it, he cannot find it out. This is the word of the Lord. Our main idea this morning is this: wisdom will lead you to your limits, where your only choice is to trust and obey God. Wisdom will lead you to your limits where your only choice is to trust and obey God. And we see this in that first section, verses 1 to 9, honor your king. The first thing we see is that wisdom tells us that we are people under authority. And no man is exempt from reality. In fact, we've already seen this in the book of Ecclesiastes. Flick back to chapter 5, verse 8. If you see in a province the oppression of the poor and the violation of justice and righteousness, do not be amazed at the matter. For the high official is watched by a higher, and there are yet higher ones over them. See, everyone has a boss or a board or a bully they must answer to. So the preacher gives us a framework. How do we live as people who are always going to be under some form of authority? Well, first, we're to seek the good of those in authority. Look with me again in verse 1. Who is like the wise and who knows the interpretation of a thing? A man's wisdom makes his face shine. And to be clear, the pronouns in English are a little hard to decipher, but I think what he's saying here is a man's wisdom makes the king's face shine. And the hardness of his face, the king's face, is changed because of wisdom. Verse 2, I say, keep the king's command because of, and you might have a footnote if you're in the ESV here, because of your oath to God. So in the context, the preacher seems to be doing a case study, as though there is an official in the king's court, a kind of what-if scenario. What should you do if you find yourself in front of the king and you have his ear? Well, first, you should be eager to exercise wisdom for his benefit, and you should be eager to obey and not to flee. This is the oath that he mentions in reference to this official. This oath compels you to give counsel to the king as you have opportunity. Yet, even as a distinguished counselor in the king's throne room, what does the preacher say? He says, know your limits. You might be significant. You might have the king's ear, but the king is sovereign. Look at verse 4. For the word of the king is supreme. And who may say to him, what are you doing? So what does this mean? Well, it means that despite your best efforts, the king is going to do what the king wants to do. Shocking, isn't it? That a king with all authority gets to pick what he wants. Therefore, Solomon tells us, how do you approach life under a fallen authority, under a fallen human king? Well, first we see we're not supposed to flee from the presence of the king at the first sign of trouble. We're supposed to keep the king's command. But verse 3, be not hasty to go from his presence. In fact, he'll mention this idea again in chapter 10, verse 4. If the anger of the ruler rises against you, do not leave from your place, for calmness will lay great offenses to rest. And if you're thinking biblically here, you can think of probably many accounts in which we saw this exemplified. We had Joseph before Potiphar and then before Pharaoh. We have Daniel before Nebuchadnezzar and then Darius. We have Esther before Artaxerxes. Each of these people are an example of people who stood before kings, who gave counsel to these kings, acted in wisdom. And in some cases, the kings listened, and in some cases, they did what they want. But you'll notice from our text, Solomon's wisdom doesn't assume that this call for honoring the king is without wisdom. It's not without prudence. For example, we're not to join the king in an evil cause. Into verse 3, do not take your stand in an evil cause, for he does whatever he pleases. The wise know when to stand with the king and when to go. Now we certainly know that Solomon is not naive. He's not suggesting that this is an easy line to follow. These are not rose-colored views of authority. He expects trouble. Look again at verse 6. For there is a time and a way for everything, although man's trouble lies heavy on him. Look at verse 9. All this I observed while applying my heart to all that is done under the sun. When? What does he see when he looks at under the sun? He sees man having power over other men to their hurt. It leads to oppression. So while we lack in sovereignty, and the king has at least some, he understands that this authority will be wielded in a way that leads to suffering, that leads to oppression. In fact, this is a very convoluted passage, but we can distill it into very simple terms. You are under authority, so use your wisdom to honor that authority. But at the end of the day, you have no control over the decisions that they make. And in many cases, it will be wielded to oppress you and others. I'm glad I had good news for you this morning. So what should we do in light of this passage? Well, number one, we should recognize authority. We should take inventory of the people and structures that are over our heads. In other words, what kings are we obliged to? Maybe it's your parents. Maybe it's your husband. Maybe it's elders. Maybe it's the church. Maybe it's employers. Maybe it's school. Maybe it's a government. Now, to be certain, the extent, the reach, the applications of these authorities, they will all look differently. But we should at very least acknowledge that God providentially has put us under authority. We are under the umbrella of someone else's rule. And notice what he says in verse 5. Whoever keeps a command will know no evil thing, and the wise heart will know the proper time and the just way. So whose command are you subject to? Are you aware of who you, by God, are called to submit to and obey? So number one, recognize authority. Number two, be in willful submission. Be in willful submission. We ought to aim to do good for those in authority over us by being in this posture. Hebrews 13:17. Obey your leaders and submit to them, for they are keeping watch over your souls as those who will give an account. Now, to be clear, in the context, the writer of Hebrews seems to be referring to elders there, but I think this can be applied more broadly. We are called to submit those in leadership. Why? Well, again, 13:17. Let them do this with joy and not with groaning, for that would be of no advantage to you. See, it doesn't do us any good to grumble and complain and gripe about the authorities over us because God has put them there nonetheless. In most cases, God did not ask you who is in authority over you. He put it there providentially. Kids, the same is for you. Ephesians 6:1, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. So since we all have authority over us, we have to learn what it means to be in submission and support of that authority. And notice the Godward orientation of this passage. Look at verse 2 again. I say, keep the king's command. But why? Why are you called to keep the king's command? Because of your oath to God. So this ultimately comes down to our view of God and our understanding of his delegation of authority over the top of us. And so, what does this look like for us? Well, it means we must ask our questions like this. Are you leveraging the influence you have to foster healthy authority, or are you undermining it? Have you, maybe unintentionally, adopted the anti-authoritarian air of the age, where there is a general disregard, one, first for God, but then two, especially for any visible sign of authority? We try to throw it off. Yet here's the rub. To escape the structures of authority that God has designed is ultimately to be enslaved by something else. See, good authority is fostered when you submit with joy and promptness. This is why maybe some of you parents use the language with your children. Obedience is obeying right away, all the way, with a happy heart. And this is why we have to start at such a young age, because there is a natural tendency for us to reject authority. So we should seek to encourage those who are over us and are exercising godly authority on our behalf. Children, for you, obey your parents. Encourage them by your obedience. Maybe you're an employee. Submit to your employers and seek to bring value to your organization. Wives, submit to your husbands as unto the Lord. Citizens of a country, find ways to honor the structures and the people in power over you. We see this idea replicated in the New Testament. Romans 13:1. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority, resist what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. So not only should we seek willful submission, but on the flip side, that good authority is undermined when we curse that authority. And there's a lot of temptation in our day and age to curse authority, isn't there? But we're actually told by Solomon, this is not good. Look at chapter 10, verse 20. It says this, even in your thoughts, do not curse the king, nor in your bedroom curse the rich. For a bird of the air will carry your voice, or some winged creature tell the matter. Now, I'm sure you have many protests in your mind when you hear me say, submit to authority, even governmental authorities. I'm certainly not saying that authorities above us are above criticism. There is a way to address these authorities that honors that God-ordained structure. So maybe, for example, you have an issue with the current administration in the U.S. Maybe you don't, maybe you don't, maybe you do, but my guess is that you do. Well, consider, does your speech about that authority simultaneously show your submission to God and your obligation to honor authority? We should speak openly and honestly about the devastation that bad authority brings. We have responsibility in our day and age to do this. We should speak boldly about the culture of death and their commitment to the extinction of humans in the womb. We should not back down when we see the wickedness of the transgender movement and our government's wholesale adoption of it. Yet, does our speech about these things reflect the reality that this administration was placed by God nonetheless? How does your speech reflect your honoring of authority? Or maybe it's not so much your lips, maybe it's your bumper stickers. So, we should be in willful submission. So 1, recognize authority. 2, be in willful submission. Number 3, obey Jesus. Because friends, ultimately, we are under the lordship of Christ. And this means that if the authorities over you, whether it be your parents, your husbands, your elders, your churches, your governments, your teachers, if any of those ever contradict Jesus and his word, guess what? Jesus wins. See, the call for submission to earthly authorities is no absolute. Charles Bridges, a pastor from the 1800s, writing on these verses, says this, "Yet no earthly sovereign can claim the right of absolute obedience. The service of man must ever be subordinated to the supreme claims of this service of God. Where therefore man's command is contrary, we must show respectful but unflinching determination. The will of God is the simple and absolute rule. God alone is worthy of homage. His law is the supreme and only guide, from which there is no appeal and which admits no rival. The throne must be for the great king," end quote. So while this passage certainly has practical implications in mind, we must realize that this is fulfilled in the rule and reign of Christ. He is the true king, the one to which we make an oath of allegiance, first through baptism, and as we'll see later, an ongoing sign of allegiance in the Lord's Supper. He is the one whose name we bear in the world. His authority trumps all others. So my question is, are you honoring the authorities that the king has placed over top of you? He is the one to whom you will give an account. He is the one to whom all service is ultimately due, and everything else is subservient to him. In fact, he's the only one that makes this kind of authority fully possible. All human authorities will fail, as Solomon has described. But friends, Jesus' authority looks nothing like this. He is the one who will never use his authority for our trouble, but only for our good. So number one, honor your king. Number two, fear your God. Look with me at verse 10 again. Then I saw the wicked buried. They used to go in and out of the holy place and were praised in the city where they had done such things. This also is vanity, because the sentence against an evil deed is not executed speedily. The heart of the children of man is fully set to do evil. Though a sinner does evil 100 times and prolongs his life, yet I know that it will be well with those who fear God, because they fear before him. But it will not be well with the wicked, neither will he prolong his days like a shadow, because he does not fear before God. There is a vanity that takes place on earth, that there are righteous people to whom it happens according to the deeds of the wicked, and there are wicked people to whom it happens according to the deeds of the righteous. I said that this also is vanity. I've told you before about the teacher that I had in middle school who would, if you said the phrase, "that's not fair," would have you write, "life's not fair, I will get over it 1,000 times. Solomon acts like a kid who had that when he was younger. That David had that task assigned to him, or David assigned that task to Solomon, and it stuck in Solomon's mind. He gets life is not fair. And he doesn't try to sugarcoat it. In fact, his answer to an unfair world is to say, yes, this world is unfair, but the good news is there is a just God. See, in this world, the wicked are celebrated and revered, and the righteous are vilified and forgotten. And he includes this parable in the next chapter. Just flip one chapter over with me, chapter 9, verse 13. I have also seen this example of wisdom under the sun, and it seemed great to me. It had significance in him. It stuck in his mind. It seared in his memory. Verse 14. There was a little city with few men in it, and a great king came against it and besieged it, building great siege works against it. And there was found in it a poor, wise man, and he, by his wisdom, delivered the city. Yet, no one remembered that poor man. But I say that wisdom is better than might, though a poor man's wisdom is despised and his words are not heard. See, friends, this is the type of world that breeds wickedness. Going back to our chapter again, look at verse 11. Because of this imbalanced scale, because the sentence against an evil deed is not executed speedily, the heart of the children of man is fully set to do evil. Maybe you've trained a dog, positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement. Dog does something good, give it a treat. Dog does something bad, swat it on the nose. Paul says our world works like this, except it flips upside down. That the wicked get what the righteous seem to deserve, and the righteous seem to get what the wicked deserve, such that it discourages righteousness and encourages wickedness. And this creates a question in the mind of the people. Well, if the righteous seem to be worse off than the wicked, then what is the point of spending so much effort striving for righteousness? Or to put it another day, why should I not do what I want to do? The heart wants what the heart wants, after all. Solomon tells us the answer to this question is a judgment beyond the veil. Look at verse 12. Though a sinner does evil 100 times and prolongs his life, yet I know that it will be well with those who fear God, because they fear before him. Solomon will say something similar in chapter 11, verse 9. Walk in the ways of your heart and the size of your eyes, but know that for all these things, God will bring you into judgment. See, the wise are those who do not presume upon the patience or the ignorance of God. They know that one day an unseen judge will bring all things into light. And this has certainly been a problem for the church as well. In fact, in the early church, Peter had to write a portion of his letter in 2 Peter to a church that was doubting the return of Christ, that was doubting he was going to return and make all things right. And so he had to encourage them that God does not count his days the same way we count our days. that God is patient toward us, not executing the judgment that we deserve so that he might bring us to repentance. This is almost identical wisdom from what we see here in Solomon. And the question is created because, as we've seen throughout this book, we cannot see beyond the veil of death. We don't know, other than the general truths that God has told us, what will happen after death. Yet we are told that the wise do not weigh their lives on the scales of man, but on the scales of God. And notice what he does. He equates the wicked life to that of a shadow. Look at verse 13 again. But it will not be well with the wicked, neither will he prolong his days like a shadow, because he does not fear before God. Especially as kids, we like playing with shadows, don't we? We like to see how big we can make ourselves, what kind of shapes we can use. And even in the movies, you see this depicted, right? Where you'll see a monstrous, shadowy figure on the wall, and then come to find out it was just a little bunny hopping around the corner, right? Well, this is what Solomon seems to be painting a description of the wicked life. See, in our day and age, it looks as though the wicked are living significant, impressive, weighty, meaningful lives. But friends, it is a trick of the light. When Solomon tells us that day is coming, what he's telling us is those shadows will one day be rendered void by the light. That there will be no more shadows, that all will be laid bare. See, on that day, the day of judgment, it will not go well for the wicked, because their life was just that. It was a shadow, it was a mist, it was a vapor, it was a smoke. But it will go well for those who fear God. See, who are the wise? They're not those who see beyond the veil. They're those who see the God who resides on both sides of the veil. So friends, what do you fear? Do you fear God or do you fear man? Do you fear God or do you fear loss? Do you fear God or do you fear inconvenience? Do you fear God or do you fear anonymity? Do you fear God or do you fear insignificance? Do you fear God or do you fear powerlessness? Do you fear God or do you fear poverty? Do you fear God or do you fear abstinence or chastity? Do you fear God or do you fear death? See, the wise are those that are willing to lose all things in the fear of God, or for us, for the sake of Christ. The wise, we are the ones who know our limits. We know that we cannot store up treasures here on earth. We know that all things will be weighed on the scales of God's balance, according to God's standard, according to God's character. In other words, the wise fear God more than anything else. So friends, do you fear God? Maybe you're here this morning and you have earned much in your life by your wickedness. You have lived for yourself and you have gotten paid for it. It has turned out well for you. Your bank account is fat. You have opportunities, you have influence, you have significance in this world. Would you hear Solomon's warning and know that it is a shadow and that it will not go well for you before God? Would you hear Solomon's warning and turn from your fear of losing those things in this life to a fear of the one who can destroy body and soul by casting it into hell? See, you might be celebrated by others on this side of the veil, only to discover that you will be judged by God on the other side. So friends, fear your God. And lastly, live your life. Look at verse 15 again. And I commend joy, for man has nothing better under the sun, but to eat and drink and be joyful, for this will go with him in his toil through the days of his life, that God has given him under the sun. When I applied my heart to know wisdom and to see the business that is done on earth, how neither day nor night do one's eyes see sleep, then I saw all the work of God, that man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun. However much man may toil in seeking, he will not find it out. Even though a wise man claims to know it, he cannot find it out. This is what I love about Solomon. He is unflinchingly simple, immensely practical. See, when we're hemmed in by our limits, by our frustrations, by our general powerlessness in this world to affect real change, what should you do? Real simple. Live your life. It's your only option. See, we see in this passage scales of sovereignty. We started by looking at the kings of this world and their limited sovereignty, but sovereignty nonetheless. And then we transition to see God's supreme and utter sovereignty in all things, that he is the judge of all things. And then he comes to us and he says, guess what? You're not sovereign at all. We are told that we don't get to pick our lives, that we don't get to pick our circumstances, that we don't get to pick the providences that the Lord puts in our life, that much of our life is spent in toil, that much of our life is spent sleepless, in anxiety, and pain. And so, what should we do? Well, we might be tempted to think, well, let's just become really wise, and then we would be able to figure it all out. But do you notice what he says there? Even though a wise man claims to know it, he cannot find it out. See, even the wisest among us, even those that you look around and you think, man, they've got it all figured out. See, the wisest are those who would tell you they don't. See, wisdom is not possessing all knowledge. Wisdom is realizing how little you know. So among other things, here are 3 ideas that we can draw from this passage. Again, it's worth repeating. Number 1, live your life because it's the only one that you have. Time and time again, we see this idea in Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes 2:24, there is nothing better for a person than that he should eat, drink, and find enjoyment in his toil. Ecclesiastes 3:12, I perceive that there is nothing better for them than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. Ecclesiastes 5:18, behold, what I have seen to be good and fitting is to eat and drink and find enjoyment in all the toil with which one toils under the sun, the few days of his life that God has given him, for this is his lot. Solomon's point, YOLO. You only live once. You have been given one life, so seek to live it well. And this is why contentment is such a vital part of the Christian life. If you didn't get a chance to listen to Blake's last sermon in Philippians, go back and listen to it. And even if you did listen to it, go back and listen to it again. It's that important. Contentment with your life, knowing that the providence of God has set your lots for you, is a big deal. 1 Timothy 6 and 7, but godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into the world, and we cannot take anything out of the world. So live your life day by day, waking up, acknowledging your authorities, fearing God, and seeking to obey him. Number 2, know your limits. Know your limits. See, it is necessary for us as people to recognize our limits. We have limited intelligence. We have limited capacities, time, energy, opportunities. We have limited health. We have limited words. We have limited attention, strength, money, influence. We have limited emotions. We have limited authority. We have limited patience. We have limited foresight. And we have limited insight. And we could keep going. The point here is that being wise does not mean an end to limits. It means we recognize that God has set those bounds for us and seeking to live well within them. And this leads us to our 3rd. Boast in weakness. See, if we just recognize that we're limited people, then we would just lament and grumble and gripe and complain. But when we recognize our limits, when we recognize our weaknesses, through the gospel of Jesus Christ, it actually gives us an opportunity to boast. Paul, speaking of one of his weaknesses, the thorn in the flesh, 2 Corinthians 12, 9 and 10. But he said to me, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weakness, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong." In other words, what Paul is saying is that he's boasting in his limitations. He's boasting in the providence of God. He has no say. In fact, he asked, "Lord, would you remove this thorn?" And the Lord says, "No." So what does Paul do? He boasts in his weaknesses, in his insults, in his persecutions, in his hardships, in his calamities. He boasts in that the providence of God has shown him to be weak. See, true life is not found in being strong and pushing past your limits. True life is found when you give up trying to gain life for yourself. True life is found when you stop trying to push past the limits that God has given you. The fish does not find life out of water. The sheep do not find safety outside of the sight of the shepherd. And so, friends, I want to encourage you this morning. You are weak. You are impotent. You are mostly uninformed about what the future holds except for the general promises of God. You are a limited human being. And in that vein, you can find life. Life in the God who has set those bounds for you and intends to use them for your good. Maybe you have this on your mug. It's kind of a cliche saying, but I think it's wonderful. I don't know what tomorrow holds, but I know who holds tomorrow. Friends, would you recognize that you need to become less and less focused on yourself, aware of your limitations? What does it force you to do? It forces you to fall at the feet of God. It forces you to fall at the one who is not limited, who has complete control over the cosmos, including your life. Go to chapter 12, verse 13. Here's what I think chapter 8 is saying, but in much fewer words. The end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. The point of Ecclesiastes, the point of chapter 8, fear God, keep his commands, live your life. Like I said, unflinchingly simple. And we have a perfect opportunity to realize our limitations this morning. As we approach the supper here in just a moment, what the supper testifies to us is that we are limited. We are limited in ourselves in our ability to approach God. And so we approach this table as weak, limited people. This is not a table of self-sufficiency. This is a table of total dependence. Just as we saw earlier, we're supposed to take an oath to honor the king. And as Christians, we take that initial oath in allegiance to King Jesus in the gift of baptism. But this table becomes our ongoing sign. So as you take this meal in a moment, honoring your king, would you endeavor by faith to cling to him always? Would you fear your God as you take this meal, confessing your sin before his face? And then, would you live your life after taking this meal, knowing that Christ has purchased your life, even the future that you cannot see? Friends, we are limited by God's design. We cannot see the future. We cannot untangle God's providence. So what are we left with? Honor your king, fear your God, live your life.